Fake HOA cops break in at 4 a.m. My Marine brother was already aiming. When three imposters posing as HOA security tried to force their way into the Henderson home at 4 a.m., it seemed like a nightmare unfolding. Hiding behind fake uniforms, they thought fear and confusion would hand them an easy victory. But what they didn't know was that inside waited Zach Henderson, a Marine with nerves of steel and a mission to protect. And just wait until you see how this night turned, and why justice, in the end, struck harder than they ever expected. The Henderson house lay wrapped in silence, the kind so deep it felt almost alive, pressing against the windows, filling the rooms, wrapping itself around every sleeping figure inside. It was the kind of night where even the faintest noise could seem enormous, where the darkness itself seemed to listen. Jacob Henderson stirred beneath his covers, caught somewhere between dreams and waking. A typical night, a typical quiet. Until a knock, sharp, heavy, too deliberate to be mistaken for the house settling or a branch tapping against glass. Jacob's eyes snapped open. For a few seconds he lay completely still, heart thudding sluggishly in his chest, mind scrambling to place the sound. Another knock came, this one louder. 3 rapid, aggressive hits against the front door that rattled the frame in its hinges. Jacob bolted upright, breath catching in his throat. The world beyond his window remained black and unmoving, like a stage waiting for the first terrible act to unfold. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the floor icy against his bare skin. For a moment he thought of waking his brother, but something, a deep, primal instinct, told him not to make a sound just yet. He crossed the room in a slow, measured creep, every board underfoot seeming to groan louder than it ever had before. Carefully, he edged toward the window and drew back the curtain a fraction of an inch. Outside, the porch was bathed in faint moonlight. 3 figures stood clustered near the front door. They wore dark clothing and strange makeshift uniforms, black shirts with rough patches stitched onto them. No flashing lights, no marked vehicles, no signs of official authority. Jacob's stomach twisted into a hard knot. Then came the voice. It barked up at the house, sharp and commanding, slicing through the heavy air. "Open up! HOA inspection. Immediate compliance required." For a moment, Jacob could only stare, trying to process the words. HOA inspections weren't sudden. They sent letters, emails, notices, and they didn't show up in the dead hours before dawn, demanding entry. The voice outside repeated the command, this time with even more urgency. The sound sent a chill racing down Jacob's spine. An inspection? At 4 a.m.? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Something was very wrong. Deep down, Jacob knew, before he even turned to wake Zach, that whatever waited on the other side of that door wasn't there to discuss homeowner regulations. And it wasn't going to wait much longer. Jacob's breath fogged the cold window pane as he leaned closer, straining to see through the darkness. Below, on the porch, 3 figures stood rigid under the pale, flickering light of the front lantern. They weren't moving like neighbors. They weren't acting like officials. They stood too still, too deliberate. Jacob narrowed his eyes, his mind trying to make sense of the scene. Each man wore a black t-shirt, but not uniformed, nothing professional or consistent. And printed across the chest of each shirt, in bold, peeling letters, was a patch that read, HOA Security. The words looked hastily sewn on, uneven and crooked, some of the threads already dangling loose. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't official. There were no badges gleaming under their jackets, no belts heavy with equipment, no radios, no visible identification whatsoever. Jacob's gaze swept past them, to the street. It was empty. No marked cars idling with their lights flashing. No support vehicles. Nothing but the still, sleeping rows of suburban houses and the long, dark stretch of asphalt. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter. These men didn't belong here, and whatever they wanted, it wasn't a conversation. Behind him, the faintest creak of floorboards broke the heavy silence. Jacob turned. His brother was already awake. Zach Henderson stood in the doorway of Jacob's room, barefoot, calm, and impossibly steady, as if he had been awake the entire time. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't waste a second with questions. Years of military service had taught him, when something feels wrong, it usually is, and you move before hesitation gets you killed. Without a word, Zach crossed the room in 3 measured steps, opened the closet, and retrieved a long black case. He knelt, flipped it open, and inside, lying perfectly nestled in foam, was his Colt M4 rifle, a weapon he hadn't needed in a long time, but one he had never allowed himself to forget how to use. Jacob watched, pulse pounding in his ears, as Zach went through the motions with mechanical precision. Magazine check, round chambered, safety disengaged, scope adjusted. Every movement was clean, silent, final. The gravity of the situation hit Jacob fully now. This wasn't just strange. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a threat standing at their front door. Zach finally spoke, voice low and certain, cutting through the thick air. "They're not real." Jacob didn't need to ask what he meant. It was obvious. The men outside weren't from the homeowners association. They weren't officials of any kind. They were pretending. And they were getting ready for something far worse. Zach's hand tightened around the rifle. His eyes flicked once to the stairs, then back to Jacob. Calm, deadly serious. Get 911 on the line. Now. For a split second, Jacob stood frozen, adrenaline locking his muscles in place. Then instinct took over. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, fumbling for a second before finding the emergency call button. His thumb hovered above it for half a heartbeat. And in that moment, as the first ring sounded in his ear, Jacob realized the night wasn't going to slip back into silence. It wasn't going to be a bad dream. It had already begun. And whatever came next, they would have to face it, ready or not. The figures outside didn't wait. There was no hesitation, no second warning. Only the sudden, violent rattle of the doorknob twisting and jerking in its socket, the metal screaming in protest. Jacob stood frozen for a heartbeat, the phone trembling in his grip. The cold air of the house seemed to thicken, every sound now painfully sharp. Scrape! The unmistakable grind of steel against steel. A crowbar. Jacob's chest tightened. They weren't trying to scare them. They were trying to get in. Bang! The door buckled under a heavy hit, the frame groaning. The wood cracked slightly, but held, for now. Jacob squeezed the phone tighter, fingers fumbling over the emergency dial. The 911 operator's voice buzzed in his ear, calm and detached, a stark contrast to the chaos about to explode around him. He barely managed to whisper, "There are men at my door. They're trying to break in. Fake uniforms, please." Another bang, louder this time, the sound of a second blow, heavier, more determined. Down the hall, Zach moved like a ghost, silent and sure. He positioned himself halfway down the staircase, a strategic vantage point. One knee braced against the banister, his body tight against the shadows. The rifle was already up, resting steady against his shoulder. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath soldiers take before stepping into the unknown. His eyes narrowed, calm and clear. Another splintering crack rang through the house. Jacob clutched the phone to his ear, heart racing so hard it hurt, backing away instinctively toward the bedroom doorway. The door downstairs gave way with a deafening snap, the lock torn from its moorings. For a split second there was silence, a heavy, suffocating pause, as if even the house itself was holding its breath. Then, boots thundered across the threshold. The first intruder stormed inside, a hulking figure brandishing a baseball bat, gripped tightly in both hands. His fake HOA security badge swung wildly across his chest with every frantic movement, catching flashes of light. There was nothing official about him now, no pretense, no disguise, only raw intent. Zach didn't move, didn't shout. He simply adjusted his aim, steady and unshaken, tracking the invader's every step, like a seasoned hunter. Jacob, still half hidden behind the wall upstairs, watched with wide, terrified eyes. Every second felt stretched and sharp-edged, the future teetering on a knife's point. The house, once a place of warmth and safety, had transformed into a battlefield, and the enemy was already inside. Zach didn't flinch. He didn't stumble backward or shout in fear. His training, buried but never forgotten, surged to the surface. Fast, cold, automatic. Years of discipline, of night raids and checkpoint drills, clicked into place like a second skin. The rifle was steady in his hands, his breath even, his mind clear. He leveled the barrel squarely at the intruder's chest, and his voice rang out, sharp, commanding, slicing clean through the rising chaos. "Freeze! Drop it!" It wasn't a plea. It was an order, the kind that demanded obedience without question. For a heartbeat, the intruder hesitated. His grip on the baseball bat tightened. Muscles bunched at his shoulders. A reckless, dangerous tension. He took a single step forward, one step too many. Zach's finger moved, a single, precise motion. Crack. The rifle fired, the sound erupting through the house like a thunderclap, not into the man, but into the wall, just inches from his head. Drywall exploded outward in a burst of dust and splinters, filling the air with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt powder. The impact was deliberate, a warning, a line drawn in stone. The effect was immediate. The fake HOA security enforcer jerked backward, face draining of all color. The bat clattered from his hands, bouncing once against the floor before sliding away. For a second, he stood there, paralyzed, eyes wide with a terror far deeper than anything he had expected to find inside a suburban home. Then, slowly, mechanically, he raised his hands high into the air, palms open, fingers splayed, no resistance left in him. Zach took one controlled step down the stairs, never breaking his aim, never blinking. Every move he made was a message, not just to the man frozen in fear at the foot of the stairs, but to the two others still lurking outside. This house is defended. You will not win here. Jacob, crouched just beyond the hallway's edge upstairs, clutched the phone tighter against his ear, heart hammering painfully. Even through his fear, even through the raw adrenaline crashing through his veins, a different feeling started to bloom inside him. Relief, pride. His brother wasn't just reacting, he was in control. Downstairs, the first intruder stood trembling, his fake authority stripped away, leaving behind only the raw truth. They had picked the wrong house, and they had no idea how badly they had misjudged their target. The crack of the warning shot still echoed through the warehouse when everything shifted. The remaining two intruders, standing just beyond the threshold, snapped from predatory confidence to pure, unfiltered panic. It happened instantly, like a dam breaking. The illusion of control they had tried to create, the fake uniforms, the commanding voices, crumbled in the face of something real, something they hadn't expected, a defender who wasn't afraid. One of them, the taller one, took a stumbling step back, boots skidding across the porch. He twisted to run, but slammed hard into the doorframe, letting out a grunt of pain. The second man shoved past him without a glance, his only focus to get away, tripping down the front steps and nearly collapsing onto the lawn. They didn't look back. They didn't call out to their partner left behind. Survival had become their only instinct. Their shapes blurred into the darkness, swallowed by the empty street, fleeing into the night with the frantic, desperate energy of men who knew they had made a fatal mistake. The shattered front door swayed slightly in its broken frame, creaking on damaged hinges as the cool night air spilled inside. Jacob crouched low at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, heart hammering so loud he could barely hear anything else. But then, cutting through the noise of his own pulse, he caught it. Sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder, closer. A wave of sound carrying with it the promise of real help. The cavalry was coming. Downstairs, Zach hadn't moved from his position. He remained a statue, solid, unwavering. The intruder, who had been left behind, stood frozen in the center of the living room, still breathing hard, his fake HOA security patch fluttering against his chest. For a moment, it seemed he might bolt too, try to make a break for it. Zach ended that thought before it could even form. His voice cracked through the thick air, low and commanding. Face down, arms out, don't move. There was no room for argument, no room for hope. The man dropped heavily to his knees, then sprawled flat onto the floor, arms stretched wide, palms scraping against the scratched hardwood. He lay completely still, head turned to the side, staring at nothing, chest rising and falling in quick, shallow gasps. Zach moved slowly down the stairs, rifle never wavering, his steps controlled and deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The situation was his now. The house was his. Every inch of his posture radiated calm, lethal authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Upstairs, Jacob's fingers tightened around the phone as he whispered to the 911 operator, "They're down. One still inside. The other two ran. Please, hurry." The operator's voice remained soothing, a lifeline of order in the middle of chaos. Jacob barely heard her words. His focus was locked on the scene below, on Zach, standing like an immovable wall between the danger and everything he cared about. In that moment, as fear still coiled in his gut and adrenaline made his limbs tremble, a stronger feeling swelled up inside him. Pride. Not the simple pride of a younger brother admiring an older sibling. This was deeper, fiercer. It was the pride of knowing that when the darkness came knocking, when real fear filled every room of their home, Zach hadn't faltered. He had stood up, he had drawn the line, and he had made sure they were still breathing to see the morning. Outside, the sirens grew louder, joined now by the sharp flash of red and blue lights dancing across the windows. The police were seconds away. But even as help approached, Jacob knew the most important fight of the night had already been won, because Zach had never given them an inch. The first flashing lights cut through the night like a promise. Red, blue, red, blue. They washed over the shattered doorway, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the ruined porch and spilled into the living room like waves of color. The sirens, once distant, now roared right outside, powerful and immediate. The heavy crunch of tires over gravel, the sharp slam of car doors, sounds that signaled one thing: help had arrived. Zach shifted slightly, still keeping his rifle trained low on the prone intruder. He didn't lower his weapon. Not yet, not until the real authorities made it clear it was time. Through the broken doorway, the first officers swept in, a fluid, practiced movement, honed by countless drills and real-world danger. They moved in formation, weapons up, eyes sharp, voices commanding, "Hands visible! Stay down! Do not move!" Jacob, still crouched upstairs, pressed himself tighter against the wall, hands raised instinctively, the phone still clutched, white-knuckled, in his grip. The officers registered him immediately, a terrified young man, not a threat, and passed by without hesitation. Their focus locked onto the figure sprawled on the floor. Two officers moved in fast, securing the intruder, cuffing his wrists with smooth, efficient motions. One swept the room with a rapid glance, confirming that no other immediate threats lurked inside. Zach, calm as ever, slowly straightened, lifting his free hand to show he meant no harm, even as the rifle remained slung safely at his side. An officer with a sergeant's stripes approached, quick but measured, his voice firm but respectful. "You the homeowner?" Zach gave a short nod. "We got the call," the officer continued, scanning the battered doorway, the scattered debris, the wide-eyed intruder pinned to the floor. "You handled it well." It took only minutes for the truth to surface. The men in fake HOA security shirts weren't officials. They weren't inspectors. They weren't from any association. They were small-time criminals running a dangerous scam, posing as neighborhood authorities to trick residents into opening their doors. Most of the time, it worked. They relied on fear, confusion, the natural tendency to obey anyone who looked official. But tonight, they had picked the wrong house. They hadn't found frightened homeowners willing to comply. They had found Zach Henderson, a man trained to spot deception, to recognize threat, and to meet it head on. One officer, kneeling by the captured man, muttered under his breath, "Bet they didn't expect this when they suited up tonight." Another laughed quietly, not out of cruelty, but in sheer disbelief at the audacity and stupidity they had just witnessed. Jacob finally stepped cautiously downstairs, legs shaky but moving. The scene looked surreal, lights flashing, officers moving with swift purpose, the intruder now looking small and defeated under the weight of real authority. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jacob allowed himself to breathe fully. The nightmare hadn't ended yet, but the worst part was over. Justice, real and undeniable, had arrived, and it carried a badge, a steady hand, and the unshakable promise that tonight, right here, right now, the right side had won. The night had finally broken. Hours after the chaos ended, Jacob and Zach found themselves sitting under the cold fluorescent lights of the local police station. The walls were painted a neutral gray, the kind of color meant to be calming, but instead felt just sterile and heavy. Outside the small interview room, officers moved quietly between desks, filling out reports, answering phones, piecing together the remnants of what had happened. Inside, the atmosphere was still tense, but it was a different kind of tension now, not the terror of imminent danger, something quieter, the long, slow processing of survival. Zach sat back in the hard plastic chair, arms resting loosely at his sides, his rifle secured away by the officers as evidence for the night. His face was unreadable, the same stoic calm he had worn through the entire ordeal still firmly in place. Jacob sat next to him, fingers nervously drumming against his jeans. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind an aching exhaustion that sank deep into his bones. The door opened with a soft click, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, with deep lines etched around his eyes. A veteran himself, if Jacob had to guess. He crossed the room in 2 strides, and without hesitation clapped Zach firmly on the shoulder. "You did everything right," the officer said, voice steady, carrying the weight of genuine respect. "You kept your head. You protected your home. Good job, Marine." For a moment, Jacob thought he saw the faintest flicker of emotion pass through Zach's eyes. Not pride exactly, but something quieter. Acknowledgement. A shared understanding between men who had seen too much of what the world could throw at them. Zach simply nodded once. No smile, no words of bravado. Because for him, it had never been about recognition. It wasn't about medals or headlines. It was about instinct, survival, duty. The officer laid a thin file folder on the table. Inside were the preliminary charges: breaking and entering, impersonating public officials, armed assault, attempted robbery. Each word on the page was another piece of evidence that the night's horror had been real and that justice would be pursued. Jacob exhaled slowly, a weight lifting slightly from his chest. The system was working. The truth was known. And Zach, calm, disciplined, and unflinching, had stood in the gap when it mattered most. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, casting the first pale light across the quiet town. A new day was coming, and thanks to Zach, they were both still here to see it. The road stretched ahead in long, empty ribbons, lit only by the faint, early blush of sunrise bleeding into the horizon. The town was still asleep, houses dark and silent, unaware of the chaos that had nearly shattered the night. Inside the car, the atmosphere was heavy, but not with fear anymore. It was something different, something quieter. A silence thick with thought, with the weight of everything that had been faced and survived. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the slowly brightening sky, hands loosely clasped in his lap. His mind replayed every moment of the night. The banging on the door, the splintering wood, the rush of panic, the steady voice that had cut through it all. Zach's voice. He turned slightly to look at his brother. Zach sat behind the wheel, one hand resting lightly at 12 o'clock, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't speak. He didn't hum along to the low static of the radio. He didn't need to. His face was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a subtle tension in his posture. Not fear, not regret, just the deep, weary awareness of a man who had been ready for the worst and found, once again, that it had nearly come. Jacob realized with a pang of understanding that this wasn't the first night Zach had faced danger, and it wouldn't be the last time the memories followed him home. Zach had seen worse, in cities halfway across the world, under skies filled with dust and smoke. He had faced real weapons, real battles, where the stakes were measured not in stolen belongings, but in lives. And yet, tonight, it wasn't rifles or armored convoys that came at them. It was men in cheap, mismatched shirts, wielding baseball bats and arrogance, hoping to catch a family off guard. But the mission, the real mission, hadn't changed. Protect and survive, whether it was a battlefield halfway across the globe or a quiet suburban street at 4 a.m., the instinct remained the same. Stand your ground. Shield the people who can't shield themselves. Endure, because surrender is not an option. Jacob swallowed hard, emotion rising in his chest. He thought back to all the stories they used to hear growing up, of heroes in shining armor, of capes and medals, of grand speeches and roaring crowds. But sitting beside Zach now, Jacob understood the truth more clearly than he ever had before. Sometimes, the real heroes didn't wear medals. They didn't carry shields emblazoned with emblems. They didn't march under banners or ride into battle to the sound of trumpets. Sometimes the real heroes wore simple clothes. Sometimes they bore invisible scars. And sometimes they just sat quietly behind the wheel of an old car, eyes fixed on the road, carrying the weight of the night without asking for anything in return. They stood between chaos and family, armed not with fanfare, but with steel nerves, clear instincts, and the unbreakable will to protect. Jacob looked back at the horizon, the first true golden light beginning to pour over the land, and for the first time all night, he felt a deep, steady sense of peace settle inside him, because he knew, whatever else came, whatever storm still waited ahead, his brother would be there, standing in the gap, without a cape, without a badge, just as he had always done. The first light of dawn stretched across the quiet streets, washing everything in soft gold. The Henderson house stood battered but steady, a silent witness to the night it had survived. The front door hung crooked, broken by force. Scattered splinters littered the porch. Inside, the scars of the struggle remained, cracked drywall, overturned furniture, lingering tension in the air. The door would be replaced, the furniture repaired, but the memory of what had happened, the memory of standing against the dark, would stay much longer. Jacob stood just inside the living room, watching the horizon brighten. Behind him, Zach spoke quietly with the officers, calm and composed, as if the chaos of the night hadn't left its mark. But Jacob knew better. He understood now. Safety wasn't a given. It was something you fought for, quietly, fiercely, without hesitation. And he knew one more thing with absolute certainty. No matter what face danger wore next time, no matter how it tried to slip through the cracks, it would find the same answer waiting in the dark. You're not getting past me. Not then, not now, not ever. The sun rose higher, and the Henderson house stood firm, stronger than broken locks, stronger than fear,